Welcome to Security Take Two. I'm Chester Wisniewski, and I'm here with my co-host, Ben Verscharen.
This is episode 10, recorded on the 18th of August, 2025. And today, we're going to be talking about WannaCry chat.
Yeah, we've been talking about this episode topic for a while, and I think it is finally the time for us to pull the trigger on this one. I was putting it off a little bit because the memory banks were a little dusty, but it all came back pretty quickly when I started digging back in and looking at the details. And, you know, we kind of mostly stick to chronological order when talking about these topics. But I'm wondering in this one, there's a slight amount of jockeying in that we believe this may have been a stolen exploit and different things like that. So maybe we start with like the moment of the event and talk a little bit about what it was, and then we can talk a little bit about maybe the precursors that led to it, and then of course what happened afterward, because it's slightly odd ordering maybe, but it feels like purely chronological. It would be like, well, what am I, what actually happened? And of course, on the 12th of May 2017, for those of you who may not remember, what happened when WannaCry was unleashed, I guess is what we would say, is it took down about 300,000 computers worldwide with ransomware and a worm. And it was kind of a bit of a nightmare scenario. I remember that day very distinctly because the worst of the damage was over by the time I got up in the morning here on the west coast of Canada. Ransomware had been a growing enterprise concern at the same time that we'd never seen one that had been wormed, right? And that ability to self-spread without a threat actor deciding to go after a particular target made it especially difficult.
Well, you say that, like, it was also just a long time since we had also seen a worm as well, right? Like, I couldn't figure out how long it had actually been, but worm in malware was really cool in the early 2000s, and I explicitly remember that back in high school. And then it went dead for a long time until May 12th, when WannaCry decided to make Wormin cool again via an exploit.
Yeah, I think the last worm I can remember, Ben, was the 2008 Conficker worm, was probably the last headline-making worm up until WannaCry.
Yeah, that to me checks out. That sounds about right, actually. So, it had been a good, 9 years since we had seen worm in malware. I think a lot of people had become quite complacent. And then along came ransomware that, for the best part, was, targeted at consumers. And then WannaCry came around and then just spread to 300,000 people and caused mass panic globally, which was just absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and this is why the timeline to me is a bit fascinating, because the first known discovery of it in the wild was at 7:44 UTC on the 17th of May. The 12th of May. And the whole thing was over. Well, it's never really over, is it? We'll talk about that at the end. But the initial wave of worming was largely over at 15:03 UTC. So it was 7 hours and 19 minutes that it kind of had the opportunity to run rampant around the world. But because of those time zones, right, 7:44 UTC to 15:03 UTC, the most impacted was Europe. Lots of computers were off in North America and Asia.
Yep.
And so the heaviest impacts to organizations were mostly within Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And so, sort of by accident, and I literally mean by accident, it mostly just impacted that time zone, because the reason it's suspended at 15:03 UTC was a security researcher known by the name Marcus Hutchins in the United Kingdom. When he was reversing the sample, noticed a domain name in the malware sample and thought, I wonder what that is, and did a whois, and it wasn't registered, and thought, I'll just buy that and then see what they were going to do with it. And it turns out, by having registered it and putting up a web server, it was actually a kill switch that stopped the initial wave of WannaCry from continuing its spread.
Yeah, I remember waking up in Australia and looking at what was known as Twitter at the time, which it had a thriving security community. And I think Malware Tech or Marcus Hutchins tweeted, "I think I just accidentally stopped WannaCry, lol," or something along those lines. And then, everyone just went frantic into researching what what was actually stopped and how the kill switch worked, which was super fascinating. So yeah, it was a very short time of infection, but it still managed to hit 300,000 PCs globally. It did estimated $4 billion worth of damage globally as well. And one of the things that I found interesting, though, is a ransom for this malware was relatively cheap. It was around about 300 USD and made about $140,000 worth of Bitcoin at the time, which I think in total was around about 53 Bitcoin. So there's a lot of money now, a ludicrous amount of money. But for a very short period of time, without that kill switch, it would have been far more significant.
Yeah, and none of it added up at the time. I mean, I recall, I work at Sophos, and we were working in the lab looking and trying to figure out what information we had to ensure that we could try to protect people who hadn't applied those fixes from Microsoft. And, none of it made much sense, right? The small ransom, the kill switch, the fact that there was no mechanism to actually decrypt, even if you paid the ransom. None of it made sense. It was clear that it wasn't really a ransomware. And ultimately, it's been attributed to North Korea, and we can talk in more detail about that as things kind of come along. But, it wasn't making much sense, right? Because the criminal groups had already figured out how to generate a unique Bitcoin wallet for every ransomware, and that was a pretty common thing. And a criminal group had never had hold of an exploit or even tried to do anything wormable, because usually they were handpicking victims at that point, enterprise victims that they could extort for hundreds or thousands, if not millions of dollars, not just spreading it randomly on any computer around the world, drawing a bunch of attention to themselves. And a kill switch is kind of also a very nation state thing to do in my mind. I mean, I guess you could be a cautious criminal that's like, oh, gee, I only want to cause some mayhem and maybe later I'll want to turn it off. But that's not a very criminal mindset in my experience. It's usually a nation state that goes, ooh, what if this goes wrong and causes geopolitical problems and could start a war? Perhaps I should have an off switch.
Which, luckily in this case, it didn't start a war. It was quite confidently attributed to, like you said, North Korea, and specifically Lazarus Group, also previously known as APT-38. There was a couple people that had indictments out for their arrest as well from the Lazarus Group. So they were pretty well known for being quite clever and causing mass damage. So it wasn't really a surprise when we saw that, they were attributed to it. But, one of the things that we noted is with this attack is there was a lot of things fundamentally wrong with the internet to allow this to take place, right?
Absolutely. And I was just going to pivot to what exactly allowed this to happen, right? So we mentioned it was a worm. Worms need some way to get in. And in this case, it exploited a vulnerability in Windows in the server message block, which is the file sharing mechanism often referred to as Samba. Based on the open source implementation of it on Linux. But it's the file sharing port in Windows servers that had to be exposed to the internet. Now, there's a bit of backstory here. I mean, that vulnerability known as Eternal Blue in SMB is alleged to have been discovered and weaponized by the U.S. National Security Agency and their Tailored Access Operations Group, or TAO, and stolen by a group known as Shadow Brokers, which I quite confidently and reliably can assure you were the Russians. Although that has not been, I believe, officially confirmed or attributed. Everyone kind of is in agreement, including Ed Snowden, who's hiding in Russia, that it was the Russians. So, I think we kind of know. But what was interesting is it was paired with a bunch of other vulnerabilities. I mean, the way that Shadow Brokers leak worked was they had a bunch of stolen NSA exploits and tools, and they published an encrypted file on torrent that was available for quite some time before it was actually leaked. And then at some point when they got mad, which appears to be related to President Trump in 2017 bombing an airbase in Syria that was in use by the Russian Air Force, they then published the password to that archive that had been widely distributed through BitTorrent previously, then unleashing all these exploits and tools. And the two important ones were this Eternal Blue, the SMB vulnerability, but also one called Double Pulsar. Double Pulsar was a backdoor that Tau used in operations. And by the time WannaCry came along, there was an estimate of about 200,000 computers in the world that had already been exploited by Eternal Blue and had the double pulsar backdoor installed before WannaCry ever even came out. So those computers were ripe for the taking, and that because double pulsar was already there as a backdoor listening, they could just feed it the ransomware binary and it would instantly execute on all those computers.
Yeah, so just to be clear on that timeline there. So in March 14th, Microsoft released a security update that patched that critical flaw in SMB v1. Now, in April 14th...
Yeah, two months earlier than the WannaCry.
Yeah, correct. So in April 14th, Shadow Brokers published the dump, which included the Eternal Blue SMB exploit. And then a month later, on May 12th, that's when WannaCry was unleashed on the world. Now, there was nothing confirmed at the time, but it was noted that there is potential that WannaCry, it didn't have the ability to decrypt. There was some discourse at the time saying, oh, well, maybe it accidentally escaped out of, whoever researcher it was or whoever malware author it was that wrote it because it had the ability to worm and it was actually a mistake. But I never really bought that line of thought around it as well. But interestingly enough, just going back to the timeline, this happened on May 12th. Microsoft acknowledged that this was an issue, and on May 13th, they actually retrospectively went back and patched and released a patch for Windows XP, Server 2003, and Windows 8 in order to prevent this from being widely exploited again. So Microsoft's response to this was, okay, let's do some out-of-band security updates for operating systems that are no longer supported just because this is so easy to exploit.
Which is really interesting because Windows XP, this vulnerability didn't work. So while it was vulnerable to it, it didn't actually work. WannaCry could not infect Windows XP through the worming function, nor Windows Server 2003. So it was really puzzling to me that Microsoft actually took their previously paid subscription-only out-of-band fixes and made them available, because while the vulnerability existed on Windows XP, it was implemented differently, and so the code in WannaCry was not successfully infecting Windows XP computers.
Yeah, but I guess the flip side to that is maybe it was only a matter of time till someone found a way to exploit that, right? If you know that there's code there...
Yeah, I think it was literally like a day later that they modified it so it could.
Yeah.
So, fair enough.
But all in all, it was pretty catastrophic. But there's a few things here that enabled WannaCry. Now, as we've talked about the fact that it was worming, but it wasn't just inside of networks. The way that it was worming was across the internet. It was like people literally had SMB published to the internet, which they shouldn't do. And I'm really happy to say, like moments before we clicked record, I actually checked Shodan and I noticed that SMB is not one of the top services that are published in America or Australia anymore. So people have actually learnt. But at that time, the fact that people had SMB just connected to the internet, so devices that were outside of the corporate network could connect back in, is what enabled this. And honestly, that was pretty poor practice in my opinion as well. So I'm happy to see that we've learnt our lesson, and WannaCry was a catalyst for change for good. All in all, the damage that it did was nowhere near as bad as it could have been, but it did have a positive influence on our industry.
But to talk about how common it was for so many critical organizations to not be blocking this at that time is pretty amazing. I mean, I think WannaCry most famously had taken out some of the National Health Service NHS hospitals in the United Kingdom, causing headlines because of A&Es and things like that having delays and having to close or transfer certain patients for treatments to other facilities, and these kinds of things were going on. But the list of marquee brand name companies that should have had security staff and funding to address these kinds of issues. I mean, this wasn't like just small businesses and individuals, right? It was Boeing, Renault, Honda, FedEx, Telefonica, Nissan, Deutsche Bahn, Hitachi, LATAM Air, Sberbank in Russia, Russian Railways, PetroChina, O2. Another reason that, I think some of us suspected perhaps it wasn't Russia or China. It was so many organizations in Russia and China were impacted by it that you're like, yeah, that'd be a pretty sloppy operation.
Well, that's why you put a kill switch in
I
there.
mean, these organizations, well, I guess, yeah, that's what your kill switch is for. But I mean, looking at that list, it's pretty amazing to think that that many very large multi-billion-dollar companies were not expediting fixes that Microsoft had published months earlier that were known to be related to a public dump of an exploit that was a 0-day that was developed allegedly by the NSA. So let's call it quite reliable 0-day.
Well, so I do agree with you, but if you have a look at the victims that you just mentioned, a lot of medical, a lot of manufacturing and medical are both just notorious when it comes to maintenance from out-of-date systems that run CNC machines or run a particular system that has to be network connected, but the manufacturer hasn't released an update for in many years. So part of me is not surprised that this happened because over time your network grows, you introduce new technology, you don't check your network stack. You don't, if you're in manufacturing and you buy a machine that's designed to cure carbon fiber, it's not standard practice, or it wasn't back then at least, to say, hey, what operating system and how many years worth of updates are you going to provide for this? So part of me is not surprised the key trend of industries that it's hit, just based on experience in working with these industries.
Well, let me see if I can surprise you then.
Okay.
Get in the time machine with me. My time machine's going to take us to August of 2018.
Yep.
Which is 15 months after WannaCry, and hundreds, if not thousands, of variants of it have been flying around the internet. A company known as Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, the world's largest microchip manufacturer, who makes your AMD Radeons and Ryzens and your NVIDIA GPUs and your iPhone chips and your MacBook chips. They got 10,000 machines hit with WannaCry when a contractor brought in an infected laptop. I mean, there's a point at which point that you got to say there's negligence involved. I don't know where that line in the sand has to be drawn, but when we're talking about 15 months after a global situation that caused billions of dollars in damage, and you're still vulnerable to it, just counting on nobody bringing in a thumb drive with the wrong file on it, that doesn't seem like proper risk management strategy to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's worth noting as well, WannaCry is still floating around the internet today. Like, if you wanted to do a fun experiment, and I'm not recommending you do this at home, and you were to put a vulnerable SMB, share out onto the internet and publish it on IPv4, there's a very good chance that it will be infected within weeks or months. Like, the one thing with worm in malware is that it doesn't really die, and it's not. Like, it's still out there, it's still pinging. There's probably devices out there that are encrypted with it, and people don't even know due to poor workplace practices.
Yes, there's still some SQL slammer out there somewhere, I'm sure. In fact, one of our coworkers, Peter McKenzie, who I consider not just a coworker but a friend, he published a report 2.5 years after WannaCry called WannaCry Aftershock. If you use your favorite search engine and ignore the AI results and type in WannaCry Aftershock, you'll find it. And we documented 2.5 years later how much noise was still out there and how many infected machines were pinging away and searching for victims. And I'm sure you're right. There's probably some now, hopefully less. But even with the kill switch, even with the Microsoft patches, on and on and on, it's still a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess we looked at the infection. We know what it is. Like, it was encrypting files. We know how it laterally moved. But like I said earlier, I actually do feel like this was a turning point for cybersecurity. And I don't know if you agree with me, Chet. Like, I know that Taiwan Semiconductors didn't learn, but there was suddenly a pivot that I found, and, I was pretty early on in my career in cybersecurity back then, but people actually wanted to know, like, how do we segregate our networks? How do we prevent this from happening again? Is there, for our older manufacturing, style networks, is there anything that we can put in over the wire, like intrusion prevention and detection, to hopefully detect this and block it before it causes any serious harm? If something similar was to happen in the future. So all in all, I feel like this was kind of like the shock that the industry needed to really get serious about cybersecurity as well. And I'm going to be controversial here. I actually think WannaCry was a net good for a lot of industries sharpening up their cybersecurity program. Do you want to shoot me down for that one?
Yeah, sure. I'll shoot you down.
Thank you.
I have a very different take. I don't think you're wrong that it was a pivotal moment that triggered action, but I think the action that was triggered is to start using someone else's computer. I think that was one of the pivotal moments where cloud adoption was taking off like crazy. And the idea of having a net app or a Windows server with SMB was going out the window, and people were going to Google Drive and Dropbox and Microsoft OneDrive. And the cloudification of infrastructure removed all this antiquated stuff that had to be patched that was being neglected and made it the cloud provider's responsibility to take care of it. And that's why I think things got better. I don't think organizations are any better at actually managing this than they were before. And as we record this in August of 2025, we just had a SharePoint vulnerability exploited in the wild a few weeks ago. That again, the people who have SharePoint on premise are still doing these bad practices the same they were in 2017. The only reason it's not a bigger problem is 90% of the world's users of SharePoint are using it in Office 365, where Microsoft took care of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So you're saying it just...
That's my take. We'll never know the truth.
Yeah.
But my cynicism suggests that I don't think companies are necessarily getting better. They're just realizing their own incompetence, and that they're better off having a service provider do something for them so that it's done properly. And that's a good practice. Like, if you cannot get those patches out there, and it is a real genuine challenge for your organization, you probably are better off using a service that can provide a patch solution for you, so that that's one less thing to worry about, and you can focus on other risk management tasks within your security organization.
Yeah, okay. Fair call. Well, let me throw a few other things at you then. So I actually think since then, Microsoft did the out-of-band updates for XP Server 2003, Windows 8, and we've seen this for some other vulnerabilities as well. I would actually say that patching in general has become easier and better for system administrators, and we're doing a better job of that. Not to maybe not Taiwan Semiconductors, but I think all in all, patching has become easier for system administrators. And we know that if you are stuck on legacy devices, legacy support is available. It's good that Microsoft's supporting customers there. It's very rare I say good things about Microsoft as well. So on top of that as well, attribution probably didn't really matter here as well. Some people think attribution matters because you need to figure out, who the threat actor group is. But in this case, it was, North Korea, and likely politically motivated. But all in all, I would say that there was, just generally reducing your attack surface is another trend that we've seen, and, taking things off the internet that don't need to be there. And, I would be surprised to see another bit of wormy malware have this amount of damage if this took place in 2025, just based on firewalling, technology such as ZTNA or ZTNA, depending on where you are in the world. And reducing attack surfaces seems to be a priority. So all in all, I think we're in a far better place than where we were 8 years ago when this first took off.
Yeah, and the North Korean stuff, I think as well that, we often see criminals sort of A/B test new scams. Mm-hmm. And then whenever a new thing comes along, when they A/B test it that's better than the previous thing, they get rid of the old thing and they move to the new thing.
Yeah.
And I genuinely believe North Korea was looking at this as a way to get bitcoins for sanctions evasion, mm-hmm. and was kind of testing the water, and perhaps this wasn't a fully authorized operation. Perhaps somebody got a little ahead of themselves and released it before it was ready. But it wouldn't surprise me if North Korea had explored ransomware as a way to get cryptocurrency to get around sanctions. And when this blew up and ultimately failed, and also caused damage to their partners, Russia and China, I think they had to rethink how else can we get cryptocurrency, and they pivoted to their current model of stealing it.
Yep.
And they make so much more money by compromising bank networks and cryptocurrency exchanges and stealing people's Bitcoin wallets and phishing than they were ever going to make on ransomware, that they've never come back to even try again. Like I might be reading too deeply into it, but it feels like this was the moment when they started going hard on cryptocurrency theft and hitting crypto exchanges and hitting the currency exchange networks for legitimate banks as well. There were a few banks that were hit by North Korea, if I'm not mistaken, by the Lazarus Group.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you've got a better golden goose that lays bigger golden eggs, no need to go back to this tactic. I think you're right. The attack surface has gotten a heck of a lot better out there, although that SharePoint thing really did disappoint me and surprise me. I mean, nothing should surprise me anymore when it comes to people making bad decisions, but it really did surprise me, because I was like, oh, thank God. Like, I thought we had, had the cross with the garlic and stuff to put that SharePoint away, and the fact that it was still on the open internet causing problems in July of 2025 did have me take a step back. But across the board, I think you're right. We probably have made some pretty big strides forward.
Yeah, so we haven't seen anything. Actually, that's not true. We saw a few variants of WannaCry as well. But luckily, in the last 5 years at least, we haven't really seen anything else worm, which is nice. All in all, I think we got lucky with that kill switch as well. I think, based on how many exposed SMB ports there were on the internet at the time and how quick we saw it run through the networks in 7 hours. Like, if it had been 24 hours or even 48 hours before someone discovered that kill switch, the damage would have been so much more severe. So I actually think we got kind of lucky there. I think Marcus Hutchin got kind of lucky there as well. But all in all, I would say crisis almost averted with this one. It wasn't as bad as it could have been.
Oh, yeah, it certainly could have been worse. And another interesting outcome was about a week after the headlines for WannaCry, the U.S. Congress passed a new bill called the Patch Act. I'm sure it's a backronym, and I didn't look up what it stands for because I just don't have the patience, to be honest. But the good thing is it revised and had a new, fresh look at the vulnerabilities equities process. And for folks that may not be familiar with this, in the United States at least, in 2010, under President Obama, a vulnerabilities equities policy or process was established to look at vulnerabilities that the spy agencies have within the U.S. and carefully determine the benefits and the risks of using them to enable U.S. spying versus disclosing them to vendors to protect the world from the risk of those vulnerabilities. We don't know what those policies look like. We don't know what kind of factors they take into consideration as far as, is there a weighting or a scoring or a percentage that's used to decide which ones get patched and which ones don't get patched. But that was done in secret in 2010. It became public in 2014 when Heartbleed happened, that the NSA had already known about the Heartbleed vulnerability. And they decided to go public with the fact that this program existed, and it wasn't like the U.S. government was blind to it. They understood the dangerousness of hoarding vulnerabilities that could be unleashed on the world and cause damage and ultimately potentially enable a worm situation like this. So there was a process, but it didn't seem like much happened with reforming or advancing that process after Heartbleed. It was more of just an announcement. And when WannaCry happened, this Patch Act got passed in Congress, and it looks like that's when there was a real serious review of how that vulnerabilities equities process worked, because I think everybody kind of agreed that things like Eternal Blue were too dangerous to use in the wild without notifying Microsoft to patch them ahead of time, that they ought to reevaluate things. And at that time, the review of the vulnerabilities to make the decision-making about which ones would be published to the manufacturer versus kept secret was moved to the National Security Council, the NSC, within the United States government. And then that's kind of all we heard about it for a while. Kim Zetter, a journalist who's amazing in information security and has been for a very long time, she published a report in February of 2025 saying that the U.S. government had finally published its first report on how many of these vulnerabilities may actually be getting disclosed to protect the world. It didn't have much context. The report said that there were 39 vulnerabilities in 2023 that the U.S. government disclosed to vendors to get fixed rather than keep them as offensive assets. And so that's good news. We don't know if they were 39 critical ones. We don't know if they were Microsoft or Cisco, or we don't know anything about them. And we don't know if it's 39 out of 100 or if it's 39 out of 40. No information was really provided or any context to judge what that number means. But it was at least some level of transparency, although with the second Trump administration, President Trump in his first week in office made it very clear that he wanted to shift the cyber focus in the United States away from defense and toward offense. And if that's the policy of the administration, I would expect that we may be going backwards now on this vulnerabilities equities process, because if you're going to go on the offensive and you're not worried about defensive, then you're going to have to keep these vulnerabilities secret so that you can weaponize them, and we may have another WannaCry.
Yeah, let's hope that doesn't happen. Like, I think that's a net negative in general. Like, I understand the premise behind it. Like, let's go on the offensive. Let's hoard all the weaponry we can. Let's potentially pay for our exploits and, keep it to ourselves. But let's be honest, like, if it's discovered by someone in the NSA, it's probably going to be discovered by someone else at some point. Like, if it's a critical bit, say, in a Microsoft operating system or a Windows operating system, people are going to be looking at it, and eventually it will be found, and it looks bad. Or let's say shadow brokers get upset again, or a similar group, and they decide to hack the NSA and then pull that toolkit. Politically, it looks terrible to be seen to be hoarding this kind of thing as well. So let's hope that isn't what's happening behind closed doors, but unfortunately, we've got no visibility into it, and we'll never know.
Yeah, it's true, and that's the thing about secrets, I guess. And there's at least some evidence that the people behind this have been identified to some degree. On the 6th of September 2018, about a year and a half after these events unfolded, charges were laid against Park Jin-hyuk, North Korean hacker alleged to work for the government. The charges were laid in relation to the Sony hack going back earlier in the 2010s. I think it was in 2014. But it was publicly referenced by different government officials that it was alleged that he was also involved in the WannaCry situation. So, these indictments don't usually result in arrests, although there was somebody arrested in Italy a month or two ago from the Hafnium group, a Chinese individual who was in Italy, arrested over Hafnium, which was the last big exchange exploit a few years back. Mm-hmm. So you never know. People do pop up on occasion, and the work to identify the individuals behind these things can be a deterrent for those who decide to engage in these kinds of activities. So while it's not as satisfying as a prison term or restitution to victims, which we'd like to see when a crime is committed, at least there's some actions have been taken.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I used to think, what's the point of doing an indictment? Like, it means nothing. But, it points a finger and says, we know what you're up to, and we know who you are. And if that means that they need to live the rest of their life looking behind their back and being like, oh, you know what, I can't go holiday in Italy, I can't go holiday in Australia, or, I can't go to the US, or plenty of other places around the world that, extradition can happen. That's a punishment in itself. So even if it doesn't result in an arrest, if you need to look behind your back and can't visit the whole world for the rest of your life or go on a family holiday without being worried, that is a punishment in itself.
Yeah, the kids are going to have to go to Disney World Pyongyang.
Wonder what that looks like.
Well, I think in general, that concludes this episode. I'm sure there's some details that we missed, and we welcome your feedback. You can reach us on YouTube if you prefer to listen to podcasts there. You won't see us because we're not currently on camera, but you can join us on YouTube at /@SecurityTake2. Our website's at securitytake2.com with all the show notes, with links to our source materials and all of our other episodes, as well as emailing us at hosts@securitytake2.com. And we have a Reddit. It's not very active, but we invite you to share your feedback with us on Reddit. Is that right, Ben?
Yeah, correct. Well, firstly, I will say, if you're going to email hosts@securitytake2.com, we are not interested in your web design skills, but thank you for the kind and generous offer. And yes, you can find us at Reddit, which is reddit.com/r/securitytake2.